So my name is Sarah Hartman, and I'm currently getting my PhD at UC Berkeley in a Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. And the topic of my talk today is leveraging Google Earth Engine to answer global engineering and natural resource questions. So before we jump in, I'm curious, do we have any engineers in the crowd? Okay, I see one modest hand. Anyone who identifies as a natural resource user or manager? Okay, so we've got a little bit of that. What I want to do today is I want to talk about some of the wonderful things I've learned about Earth Engine. And this audience might appreciate that I joke that my PhD will be thanks to Google. So please stay around, Google. But I think before we get to this point, I want to talk about how I got here, because my background is actually in engineering, and I've moved a bit more into the resource management side. And so just after my undergraduate degree, I moved to the Central Highlands of Mexico, which has some water quality problems that are affecting the local communities there in terms of access and in terms of high levels of arsenic and fluoride, which are a very engineering-specific challenge. But this was happening in a much broader context of what's going on in the region, which is large-scale agricultural change. However, I was working for a small nonprofit that relied on its funding as the limitation for what type of data it could use and access. So it was very data limited and very region specific. Shortly after that, I moved to Central Philippines. The Philippines is a country of over 7,000 islands. And so as I was doing yet another water infrastructure project, I continued to think about this challenge of some of the localized data we have. And what really struck me, what really kind of compelled me towards my current PhD is while I was working on these small islands where the only data we could use was what was locally collected, we also had happening every single year since at least the 1980s, satellites flying overhead, right? And so some of you might work with satellites in your research, and you may be aware of the fact that for most parts of the world, you can get relatively good coverage of what's been happening on the Earth from space since at least the 1980s. And so this is an example of the region where I was working in, where you can see these different islands that, on each little island, you're collecting data for that island, but how do we start thinking about each of these small parts as part of one bigger whole? And how do we leverage what we're getting in the sky to ask these very localized questions? And so what led me to my PhD, and something that continues to drive me to this day, and perhaps drives many of you to be here for this talk, is the question of how we can use big data. And specifically here, I'm thinking about Earth observation, our satellites, to inform global engineering and resource challenges. And this is really what I'm trying to learn how to do, both in my direct research as well as in my free time. And so now I've transitioned into an environmental science program. But in my free time, I really want to explore this part. So I'll start here. I'm going to start with how we can use Google Earth Engine for engineering applications. And then just as a little sneak peek, towards the end of my talk, I'll mention my research that I do for my PhD. And so to do this, I do this with an organization called Engineers Without Borders. Is there anyone in the crowd who might be familiar with it? I know we have at least one engineer. Okay, great. So Engineers Without Borders works all around the world, including here within the United States, to help take the engineering skills of our trained professionals in the US and use them to, one, empower communities to meet their basic human needs, while also, two, equipping leaders, so these are the volunteers of the organization, to solve the world's most pressing challenges. And their vision is to create a world in which every community has the capacity to sustainably meet their basic human needs. Now, because this is an engineering-based organization, we're talking a lot about infrastructure. We're talking about bridges. In the background here, what you can see is a water system. This is a water treatment system. We're also talking about schools, health centers, any sort of infrastructure. This is the type of work that this organization is doing, both domestically and abroad. And so I'll just go through this because we're actually going to break this down, so bear with me for just one moment. These projects take a minimum of 5 years, and they can be extended many more than that. And they begin with the project formation. So this is an active partnership between an engineering chapter and a community somewhere else in the world. And you can imagine that when one of these starts, there's a lot of information that has to be gathered between project formation and the assessment. An assessment is the part of the engineering design where you're starting to understand the local context of what's needed in terms of design constraints, in terms of economics, in terms of social constraints. But there's a lot of information that we need to gather before we get to the implementation, which is when you're physically building a system. And you can see we have a bit of a cycle going on here. So within every engineering project, you're going to kind of cycle through implementation as well as evaluation and monitoring. You're going to do that depending on the project, depending on the needs of the project. You know, if a natural disaster hits in the middle, that's going to change the trajectory of your project. So we might end up cycling in this middle section for a while before we get to the closeout. Now you might be asking, okay, hold up. I thought I came here for an Earth Engine presentation. So have no fear. Now what I want to talk to you about are the opportunities to use Earth Engine. And these are things that I myself have explored and will show you in just a few moments. So I mentioned that this assessment phase is the beginning, right? Imagine it's a blank slate. You don't know anything about the community where you're going. So any sort of data you can get that is accurate, that may be time-stamped, that gives you any sort of spatial resolution is already better than nothing, right? And so when you're in this assessment phase, Earth Engine, which is, if you've seen some of the other platform presentations today, Earth Engine is a platform on which you can interact with a multitude of data that the Earth Engine engineers are putting up onto the cloud, right? And so while I mentioned satellites earlier, that is by no means the only type of data that's up there. And so you can start to collect pre-trip baseline information before you've ever visited a place to help strengthen your preparedness for the very first time you arrive on site. And so you might be able to gain insight into infrastructure. So you might be able to see this from space, water resources. Within Earth Engine, there are quite a few layers that you can use to look at water. You can look at agriculture, which may be the dominant economy, and you can look at something like climate. Now, if you're not yet convinced that Earth Engine can help, let's also think about how it can be used in later phases. So now you're working in the location of the community, you've done the design, it's been signed off by the lead engineer, and now you're building it. I would even argue that during this phase, it can still be helpful to use some of the data products that are being kind of uploaded in near real time into Earth Engine. And so you may still be able to get certain types of new technical data for engineering analysis and design, as well as, and I would say this is a bit limited because we're talking about maybe different spatial resolutions from what you need, but you may be able to get near real-time imagery. So let's say, for example, you're working in a rural area that doesn't have internet access, and the only way you can interact with your community is for someone to travel, let's say, 2 hours to a place with internet access. In the periods between when you're talking to that community, you may be able to see near real-time imagery that helps inform you of what's happening on the ground. And so I'm going to actually talk about a case study. So beyond what I've just talked about, there's also another very real challenge that we've had recently in trying to do design projects in other parts of the world. And some of you probably know what I'm talking about, right? The pandemic, which has made it very hard in our research, in our personal lives, to be as mobile as we once were. And so herein lies yet another opportunity in some of these data sources that we can get through an interface like Earth Engine. And so in fact, the Engineers Without Borders San Francisco chapter, which is what I'm a part of, we began an engineering project in Ecuador during the pandemic. And so this was really how I first started thinking about, all right, how can I use what I'm already using in my PhD for this project that would otherwise have been put on hold until the pandemic was over, which, you know, we really didn't know how long it was going to be. So what I decided to do was try to take the things I was learning for my PhD anyway and apply them to this project. And so I started with a rectangle. And it might not look impressive, but every single Engineers Without Borders design starts with this rectangle. It's a 4-kilometer by 7-kilometer rectangle around the community. And that's what they want. In their very first assessment report, they want this rectangle. Sure, why not? So I went, okay, so we're going to start with that. And let's see what I can do within Earth Engine. So let's see what we've got here. This is a video, so bear with me. I'm going to try to narrate what's happening, and we may jump around a bit. But what I'm about to show you is a video of me working within the Earth Engine interface. Here, while I talk, I'll just go back. So effectively, as the chapter, we were stuck. We were like, okay, we don't have great internet access to interact with the community directly. We want to begin doing the baseline data collection. How can we do it? So I went into Earth Engine and I started developing an interface. And one thing I was thinking about is most of my colleagues, most of the other volunteers, their day job is design. They don't do coding. And I was like, okay, well, how can I make this as user-friendly as possible so that any Engineers Without Borders chapter anywhere can just and start getting, again, we're talking baseline at this point. So let's see what we can find in this video. And it may take a moment to load. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with this. We're kind of looking in the original Earth Engine interface. It's kind of zoomed in. So this is, like I mentioned, the interface. And I won't be doing a live code demo. But up here, what you see on the left-hand side, we have some code. On the right-hand side, it says click to start. We all love that start button. And here you can put in your coordinates of, remember that 4x7 rectangle. Here we're actually going to specify the size we want in case we don't want a 4x7. So here we go. And then we're going to apply our selection and go to our location, which again, as you remember, is within Ecuador. Here I am zooming out so you can kind of see where in the country we are. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. Okay, so now the next thing I want to do is I want to build a map. And this is going to give me super baseline data. So I've preset it with these satellite images. First, you're seeing 1990. And now we're going to look at 2020, because that's what I preset. But we could also do 2022. I just don't have it right now. And whoa, okay, so do we see this? This is a river that has dramatically changed shape over the time period. I'm really curious about that. Okay, so I have a water body layer. I can add that in, and this is all within Earth Engine. I did not create this by any means. I'm also interested in deforestation. Okay, so I can start to see where in this area there's actually been a lot of deforestation. Okay, change in water occurrence. I'm going to pause at this one actually. Okay, so this one's really big. Over 60% of the Engineers Without Borders projects are water projects. So any information we can get on water is probably going to be helpful, no matter what the project ends up being. So if I can, without physically go to the community, see that there's been this dramatic of a change in where the water is occurring, I can already start to think about the engineering design, right? You know, is part of the problem that the river has changed shape and now I cannot get to the water source. Maybe the community already has the infrastructure, but now the water has changed shape. Perhaps the river has dried up. And already with this type of interface, I'm able to start thinking about those questions. And as you remember, the reason this is valuable, it's not to say this specific thing happened, It's for me to start thinking about what could the design constraints be, what could, to prepare me for that very first trip, that very first visit, what type of questions should I be asking based on what I'm seeing here? So I think the video, we've done the video, and I have a few pretty images for you. But to summarize, so what does this interface do? So this was what I showed you at the very beginning. You're putting in your project site coordinates. You can do it anywhere around the world. So that's a lot of fun. I did it for my hometown just out of curiosity. You can pick your rectangle size, and then you can go to your location. And then the next thing that you're really doing is building a map, which is really up to you about what you want to look at. Right now, it just has a few features, although if anyone has ideas of other data layers to add in, please come find me. But here we have the satellite images, just so we can get like an image of what's happening in each of these years. We have landscape features, such as water bodies, forests, and deforestation. For some of our projects, it's going to be really helpful to know about topography. So here we have topography. And then I also really like the night lights, even though it's really coarse resolution. I think that's really cool. So you can see where how much light density there is in the area. And so I guess this is just to kind of reiterate what I just was showing in the video. But here you can see for this rectangle, you can already see where the trees have been lost. And then you can see when they've been lost. And so maybe some of the challenges that are happening in this region are in fact because of something else. Maybe the industries are changing. Maybe there's been so much deforestation that the local economy has been disrupted to something else. So these are all things, again, that you can just think about. It's good food for thought and ways to prepare for that first trip. And then again, for topography. Although I will say for topography, the resolution really matters, and we haven't tested this particular one. I think it gives you a good baseline, but getting on the ground elevation changes is really valuable for certain types of infrastructure projects. So I don't want to say it's a end-all be-all. And so what did we just do with Earth Engine? What was it possible to do with just this simple set of clicking? We saw the change in river path, which might have design implications for water supply. We saw deforestation, implications for resource use. And the other one I didn't mention, but you can see that a big road was built. And so this has really big implications for accessibility to markets, supplies. If you're thinking about designing something, you need to think about how do we get the supplies to the location that we're designing in. But a road can also be an indicator of other socioeconomic changes in the region. And so it actually can be a really important thing to pin down when it happened, so then you can start asking questions about it. And kind of to wrap up this example in Ecuador, some of the engineering team actually got to go for that very first assessment trip, I think about 2 months ago. And so this is some of the team meeting with the local community board. And so it was really great to see that we were able to start this project, able to get some of that baseline data. But then, of course, what do you do with that? You bring it to the community and you start working together on how these things that we can observe from space are interacting with their daily lived lives. And so I also just want to say this is something I firmly believe, and this is what drew me to my particular PhD. I believe that free and accessible data can help make more informed decisions. And here, because it's an engineering context, I said design decisions, but I really think in terms of policy too. And I also think they're a part of our sustainable future. As we can kind of more creatively leverage the technologies that we have and make them more accessible to people who might not be directly trained in how to code, then we can make more impact with all of this information. So what are some of the strengths that I've tried to get into today? Google Earth Engine is great. It's accessible anywhere with the internet. It can help save time and money in evaluations. It can expand our understanding of resource use in space and time, and ultimately help us make more informed socio-environmental decisions. Now, at the same time, it's not perfect. And I think with any tool, you need to be aware of its limitations. And so I put up a few that I think are always important to remember, right? It's not perfect. It doesn't have all the data. There is limited spatial, spectral, or temporal information. We're not going to be able to answer all of our questions from just what's available online. It surely cannot capture social changes. It might be able to capture indirect changes of social changes, but not the changes themselves. And last but not least, and I really want to emphasize this, it's always best used as a supplement to local information on the ground. And so I kind of want to leave you with that. And I hope that we can all find creative ways to use this platform and use this data to help make more informed decisions and to help others access the data themselves to make informed decisions themselves. I'm going to skip really quickly. I know I'm running out of time. So if you're interested, my main research does agriculture. My talk here was about using Earth observation to measure shifting patterns in Ukrainian agriculture during conflict. I use Earth Engine, shocker. I also use Street View. Google Earth Street View is fantastic, and it has some really helpful ground truth data sources. And here's a really cool example of what you can do with it. You can map crops in another part of the world. These are not finalized results, so please know with this caveat that this is not like a fully perfected model yet, but this is what we're working towards. And with that, I'll just thank you, and please, please, please connect. I would love your ideas. I would love to collaborate. Thank you.